There we go.
There we go.
There's Miss Garcia. Hello, Dorothy.
Hello. Morning.
There, that's good. That's good. All right. I've got 11 minutes after the hour. So we are back in the room. Some folks are maybe still trickling in, but we'll get going and we'll get started again on the agenda. We have connected with Dorothy. Dorothy Garcia is director of the Global Disability Equality Index. She is with the National Office of Disability in. And so we are extremely happy to have Dorothy with us this morning, representing the national office, and as they continue to provide support to us here at the local level with the Arkansas affiliate. So Dorothy is going to present why DEI, the benefits of participating in the Disability Equality Index. So Dorothy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. We didn't know if it was possible for a while, but we made it possible. It's actually Disability Employment Awareness Month in October, so we are very busy, especially as disability inclusion becomes more of a global priority for a lot of multinational companies. As I mentioned before, my name is Dorothy Garcia. I am the director of the Global Disability Equality Index here at Disability In. The Global Disability Equality Index came about as a result of multinational companies demanding a similar tool to the US DEI. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It has been in operation for the last 8 years, but there's no current equivalent on the global level. And so they wanted to be able to benchmark their satellite locations around the world. And so we're trying to create that tool now. We're currently in phase 2 of the pilot, tweaking the questions. We've created an online platform and are in the process of determining what the future of the global DEI will look like. One way that it could show up in the future is as a universal tool, wherein the US DEI and the global DEI will be combined, and there will be different avenues for different countries with legal frameworks that might not make it possible for people with disabilities to self-ID in the workplace. But we are still very much in the beginning stages of that. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the presentation and give you a little bit more background on the US DEI as it currently stands. And then a little bit of a background on the global DEI and what the possible futures are for both tools. So let me go ahead and do that. Oh, Elizabeth, would you mind giving me screen sharing permissions? I am not able to share my screen for the slides at the moment. Okay. You can make me a host, and that way I would be able to do it.
I was trying. It's
Oh, I've got it. Perfect.
good.
Thank you so much. Okay, I think we're in good shape. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, perfect. All right, we'll get right into it. What are the benefits to participating in the DEI? How it might be essential for your company, whether you're a US-based company that has no locations outside of the United States, or a US-based company with some satellite locations outside of the United States. Okay, so the Disability Equality Index is a comprehensive benchmarking tool. We call it the starting point or a roadmap. So if you are a company who is interested in venturing on disability inclusion, for a great many reasons, right? So we recently came out of a global labor market shortage. A lot of companies found that good motivation to increase their hiring of people with disabilities. A lot of times, companies have realized that participating in disability inclusion and being seen in public as a disability inclusion champion actually raises their profile in the public space. And a lot of consumers respond really well to companies taking a stand for inclusion. So those are the number of reasons and a lot more that companies choose to join us for the DEI. But it's where we start and figure out where you are in terms of disability inclusion. So you take the questionnaire, it takes you through hundreds of questions. It's very comprehensive, the US version. And following your questionnaire responses, we give you detailed recommendations according to different categories within the DEI. So I will mention those a little bit later. DEI overview. What is the DEI? Participating companies do receive a score. The score can go anywhere from 0 to 100. Those companies that earn a score of 80, 90, and above are recognized as best places to work for disability inclusion. The DEI was a tool that was developed by people with disabilities for the purpose of hiring, helping companies hire more people with disabilities in the workplace. We are collaborating currently with the American Association of People with Disabilities, among one of the many people on our committees. And then in terms of categories, these are the categories that are measured within the DEI, culture and leadership, which can include things like who's on your executive board and are they allies for disability inclusion or do they themselves identify as people with disabilities? What does your culture in the workplace look like? Is it inclusive? Does your leadership include people with disabilities? Questions like that. Enterprise-wide access is very concerned with making sure that all that the company has to offer is accessible to people with disabilities. So it can be questions that have to do with your facilities accessibility, whether there's a review process to determine how accessible your facilities are, whether you have processes in place for people with disabilities to request a change within company facilities and things like that. Employment practices is divided into 4 subcategories, as you will see a little bit later. Community engagement measures how well you interact with the disability community and take in the issues that are nearest and dearest to our hearts and incorporate them into your disability inclusion strategy. And supplier diversity has to do with how many disability-owned business enterprises you regularly engage with on the supply side. And as you can see, the US DEI currently includes non-US operations. It's not a weighted category at the moment because we do have a number of companies that are only based in the US. And in the future, it might be combined with the global DEI or replaced altogether. We'll see. But as for now, it's still in there. We did actually experience a huge growth in the DEI over the last year. As I expressed before, there was a global labor market shortage between 2021 and 2022, especially. And so that brought us a lot more participants. So we went from having something like 320 to 415 in the latest Disability Equality Index. So these are the categories that I mentioned before. And this is how the points distribution works. So as you can see, the largest number of points that you can earn is under employment practices. And employment practices has the following subcategories. It has benefits, it has recruitment, employment, education, retention, and advancement, as well as accommodations. The next largest possible points that you could earn would be under culture and leadership. And then everything else is worth 10 points, enterprise-wide access, community engagement, and supplier diversity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2022 DEI report. And we had actually never done this before. We'd never looked at 8 years of data before and charted out what it actually looks like for a company to join the DEI in the long term, right? So if you join in and your company scores a 30, and then within the next year you score a 40, what are the factors that go into that? And what it would actually take for you to reach a score of 80, 90, or 100. The 2022 DEI report is the first time that we actually did that. And we found that although some companies can make a huge dramatic jump from only scoring a 50 to scoring a 90 within 2 years, it does actually take a lot of work to stay there because the DEI is not a static tool. Every single year, we make improvements to it. Some questions that are currently unweighted will become weighted in the future. And that all figures into your score. And it does take work and time to be able to implement the policies and practices that are relevant to those questions. So if you're interested, you can look up the 2022 DEI report on our website. And there's also a link there that shows you what the questions are for 2022. We never keep them a secret. We're always transparent about what questions will be asked. And the DEI report is available to everyone, whether you're a disability end partner or not. So how we structured the 2022 DEI report is according to the categories of practices. We found that foundational practices are the industry standard. So these are measures that are implemented by upwards of 65% of companies that take the DEI. And I'll give you some examples in the later slide. The second category is emerging trends, defined as practices that push comprehensive inclusion forward. And they're embraced by about half or more of the companies that took this year's DEI. And then the new imperatives for success are really for those disability inclusion pioneers that seek to go beyond sort of like the foundational practices or the basics of disability inclusion and are shooting for belonging rather than just inclusion for their employees. You can see from this slide what the categories are and what the examples of policies and practices are under each category. So for foundational, which we've mentioned is 65% or more of companies, an inclusion and diversity statement that specifically mentions disability is pretty standard and par for the course. Reasonable accommodations for employees and candidates, such as, if somebody requests an ergonomic chair, or if a deaf person requests captioning or an interpreter for special events. This is something that's now provided by well over 65% of participating companies within the DEI, which is a huge change from where we were when the DEI first started 8 years ago. And we're really proud of that fact that of all the companies that have joined us, they've been making steady progress to make disability inclusion not just a priority, but part of the fabric of their workplace, really. Foundational practices also encourage self-ID and provide ways for people to identify themselves as people with disabilities in the workplace and to ask for the accommodations that they need in order to be able to do their jobs well. Wellness benefits beyond above and beyond what the law requires, and in terms of mental health was something that really went up during the pandemic. As we all know, the pandemic was a huge stressor, and that's something that opened up a lot of discussion around mental health and wellness, and it's become less of a taboo now, as opposed to pre-pandemic spaces. And so a lot of companies responded in kind when they realized that their employees were facing incredible stress at home, and having to both deal with the pandemic and all of the delays and all of the consequences of the pandemic. Disability-focused ERGs are also pretty standard now. I think for the global DEI, it's something like 88% of participating companies actually have an active ERG. Within the ERG space, there's also a number of companies that have made it possible for executives to be the executive sponsor for that ERG. And so these ERGs are becoming more and more vocal and pointing out opportunities and gaps in the strategy for their individual companies. Philanthropic support of disability inclusion has become much more standard as well. So this is just the first category. And if you can imagine what it looks like, what the landscape looked like in 2014, you'll see how far we've come in that 65% or more of companies already have all of these practices in place. In terms of emerging trends, centralized accommodations and internal accessibility experts is a little bit more rare, but still pretty, pretty up there in terms of a policy or practice that's implemented by 50% or more of participating companies. Accessibility design policies for internal and external technology and communications, that also became very key in the pandemic with so many people working at home. Having a formal supplier diversity program and having disability-owned business enterprises as a part of that. Disability inclusion training for recruiters. This became very key in the pandemic with the global labor market shortage and the lack of qualified candidates for a lot of open positions. So a lot of companies are now training their recruiters, especially within the tech industry, who are looking for neurodiverse candidates who are also drawn to the tech industry. So it's sort of like a mutual interest in that sense. Recruiters are being trained in order to do this in a sensitive and considerate manner, doing away with personality profile screenings and things like that. We also saw a rise in senior executive support of people with disabilities and employees with disabilities. There are a lot of new signatories to the CEO letter for Disability In, which is really great because it shows support from the top down. But as I will mention later, the global DEI findings showed us that leadership from all different levels really matters for advancing disability inclusion. And then a lot of companies are also starting to track progress beyond hiring. So we all know it's great to recruit from a diverse population, but if the people with disabilities that you've hired kind of drop off after a year or two, or they move on to other companies, or they don't make it to management positions within 5 years, then it's going to be worthwhile to you to look at your retention and advancement strategies. And make sure that the people with disabilities within your company can actually imagine themselves in a career trajectory within your company. New imperatives for success. So these are the sort of pioneering strategies for disability inclusion that are done by less than half of companies. So I would say really we're at 30% here. And for a lot of them, they include companies like Microsoft and Google, as you would expect, huge tech companies with a lot of resources. But we're also finding that a lot of startups and a lot of tech companies who are starting to become more attuned to the neurodiverse community have implemented a lot of these strategies. So they might be starting from scratch, but their ambitions are very high. And so they're amplifying their employer brand externally and internally. And they want to be seen as disability inclusive. They want candidates to know that not only will they be safe in this workplace, but they will be welcomed and celebrated. These companies are also starting to aggregate employee engagement results for employees with disabilities. So they're starting to check, are employees with disabilities satisfied with how we're approaching inclusion? How quickly are we able to fulfill accommodations requests? Do we get a good score for fulfilling them? Did we fulfill them in a satisfactory way? That kind of data becomes really important. They also offer self-service assistive technology. So a lot of the tech companies especially are sort of enamored with every new advance when it comes to technology that's accessible. And so they have invested in a lot of new technology. I am not a tech expert by any means, but we do actually have a chief accessibility officer who is a self-professed geek when it comes to accessible technology. His name is Jeff Whistle. And we always just kind of take his name in vain and offer him up as help for companies who are looking to get deeper into assistive technology. Accessible audits and usability studies to make sure that their technology is actually accessible to a lot of different people. A lot of these pioneering companies also have a supplier diversity webpage that lists all of their disability-owned business enterprises that they work with. They have disability-focused ERGs that also have a lot of communication with higher ups. So at the executive level, there's a lot of communication going on. And those disability-focused ERGs drive a lot of the initiatives within the company that push them towards deeper inclusion. And these companies also publish disability demographics, which is really great, especially if you have company-wide goals for hiring people with disabilities. So this is the timeline for the USDEI. Registration is currently ongoing. It closes at the end of January or thereabouts. And then the end of January is also when the benchmark is available online. As I mentioned before, the questions are available on our site. So if this is something that your company is considering, you can have an advanced look at the questions and see if you have the bandwidth to be able to complete, I think, 300 questions for the USDEI, and if it's something that your company would like to participate in. April 7 is when final responses are due, and then after that, we finalize the scores. And then July 12, which is usually around the time of the annual Disability and Conference, is when top scoring companies are announced. And the DEI report will be available. So what do you receive for participating in the DEI? What do you receive for answering 300 plus questions and putting in many hours and trying to find out the answers to these questions? You receive your scored report, so all of your answers plus your company score broken down by each of the categories that I showed above. So culture and leadership would give you the score, enterprise-wide access, and then we would also detail what questions you did not answer and what our recommendations are for that particular category. The scorecard also provides your company score broken down by DEI category and question set. And then it has all of our recommendations. You can request a follow-up deep dive where we give you a personalized deck and go over each question in greater detail. But you also have a response comparisons table, which shows how your company responses compared to the entire body of responses that we received that year. So it'll tell you if there were 415 companies that participated this year, 80% of these companies said yes to this question. And then it will show you where you are in terms of your own particular industry. So you can see if you're being competitive within your industry when it comes to disability inclusion. This is where different top scoring companies are recognized. We have a website, we have the report. They're recognized on the AAPD website as well. And it's pretty much just like a media blitz in July with a lot of different companies announcing their scores. And, we try to amplify those posts on social media as well. So moving on to the global DEI, because we're very ambitious and we're never satisfied with just one usable tool. The global DEI, as I mentioned before, came about as a result because of the number of multinational companies that we work with who didn't have a similar tool for their satellite locations around the world. And this is significant because the US DEI has the Americans with Disabilities Act as its backbone. And there are comparable acts around the world, and some even go far beyond the Americans with Disabilities Act in terms of what they cover. But for me, for instance, I grew up in the Philippines. There is no protective legal framework for people with disabilities in the workplace in the Philippines. We don't even have a lot of infrastructure that would make it possible for people with mobility issues to show up in the workplace. So when we mean that, some countries are starting from zero, it's absolutely true. And in those cases, the global DEI becomes really instrumental because you can encourage the companies to set their own standards for disability inclusion. And if they have satellite locations around the world, they take the global DEI and then it shows them where their starting points are, where satellite locations need additional support in order to be able to implement company-wide policies, and where certain countries are actually doing better. We've found from the global DEI that it's not actually necessarily true that resource-rich countries do the best on these questionnaires. There's a magic formula, and it's the active ERG, a passionate in-country leader, plus support from the C-suite executive that determines how well they do in terms of disability inclusion. So I think the global DEI is fulfilling that role as well that the US DEI does in establishing a roadmap. And right now, because it's currently half the length of the US DEI, it's a really great starting point, and it's a really great tool to be able to adapt into different cultural contexts. So this is the timeline for the GDEI. It's actually, we've kind of split the year, and the US DEI goes from January to July, and the global DEI goes from July until the deadline for submission is December 16. We also offer the same kinds of deep dives. We have scorecards and analysis sent to participants, and we've learned so much from the process of actually talking to participants and finding out if these questions are relevant in different cultural contexts, right? So we found out in a lot of these conversations that in the European Union, for instance, there are countries that don't allow employers to ask if employees have disabilities. They don't even allow self-ID. So you identifying yourself as a person with a disability is something that would have to be justified in Spain, for instance. Spain really puts the burden on the employer to deem it necessary to find this, because otherwise they assume malicious intent, and they wouldn't want you to have that data to hold against somebody. A lot of the things that we've found too, just speaking to different cultural contexts, is that there is still so much stigma around disability around the globe. So I talked a little bit before about how mental health became less of a taboo to talk about, especially in the workplace during the pandemic. That's not necessarily true for every country. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily true for different levels of leadership. So in one particular company that participated in the global DEI, there was a CEO who actually really wanted to disclose that they had struggled with mental health for a number of years, clearly succeeding in life as a CEO of a global company. And they were all set to disclose, and legal stepped in and said, we're afraid that our share prices will fall if you disclose. So I don't think, the company didn't allow it. So in case we start wondering about, whether these questions are still relevant today, that definitely still comes up, both in the US and the global context, especially if you are an employee with a disability who's looking to move up. It's not necessarily something that's seen as a plus, especially when you are disclosing a mental health issue. If you're disclosing a learning disability, all of which are seen as threatening to your image as a higher up leader. So we still have a long ways to go. As you can see from that slide that had the different categories of foundational practices, emerging trends, and new imperatives, we've already come a long way, right? We're slowly starting to get people to come to our side and see that an integrated workplace where people with disabilities are not just tolerated, but celebrated for all of the different obstacles and all of the different challenges that they face on a daily basis that gives them problem-solving skills. for all of those advances, we still have so much work to do in terms of awareness. And because it's becoming a rapidly more globally integrated world, this is becoming necessary to do on a global level and a global scale as well. So I'll stop there and take questions if they're available. And I'm happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, Dorothy. Excellent presentation. We've got a few minutes. If anybody has any questions for Dorothy, I'll be the go-between and I'll translate and get the question over to her. If anybody has a question here in the room.
Or ask Dorothy, is there a cost associated with taking the DEI?
Dorothy, the question is there a cost associated with doing the DEI?
So for the Disability Equality Index, if you are a non-disability in partner, the cost for taking the DEI is $650. It's a flat fee. And it includes all of the benefits that we mentioned before, the scorecard, the analysis, the one-on-one deep dive with somebody from our benchmarking team. For the global DEI, it's currently being offered at no charge because we're still in phase 2 of the pilot. And it's an information gathering stage. So it's kind of like, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. We give you information about where you are in terms of disability inclusion. And these companies give us feedback on whether the questions are actually relevant, whether our platform works, and whether we can make additional improvements to make the tool better.
Very good. Anybody else in the room have any questions for Dorothy? Going once. Dorothy, I think you're off the hook.
That's
No more
fine.
questions here in the room, but thank you very much for connecting and thank you very much for spending time with us here in Little Rock today.
Okay, absolutely. Have a great rest of your meeting.
All right. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.